Hello, welcome to Image Bearers. My name is Atoma Eji. We are at season 3, episode 63. My good friend Michael Burns is joining us today. I recently listened to his podcast, which is All Things to All People with Michael Burns. And he shared about a word I think I had heard him share before, but he kind of elaborated a little bit more. And that word is anti-discipling. And really, I think it's a great way to help us understand some of the influences that can negatively affect our spiritual life as kingdom citizens. And I wanted him to perhaps break that down a little bit more. So again, welcome to the program, Michael.
Always good to be with you, Toma.
Yes, and thank you for being so gracious and joining probably more than anyone. So I definitely appreciate that. And that's not to say you're just sitting around twiddling your thumb. I know you got like 1,000 things to do and all the books behind you to read. So I definitely do appreciate that.
You know, there's never enough time to read books.
This is true. This is true. This is true. So I wanted to just start out again with the word that you had coined, anti-discipling. If you could maybe just break down the word and why you feel it's important for us to have this kind of a word in our lexicon or whatever.
Yeah. So the first thing is I like that you're saying anti-discipling and not anti-discipling, because, you know, let me affirm at the beginning, I'm not anti-discipling.
Correct.
In the sense of against. So the word anti can mean instead of, or it can mean more the anti-against root. So it's definitely not in the sense of I'm against discipling. I affirm the idea of discipling as a really good and biblical thing. But what is discipling? And I would categorize it, although you could, you know, cut this pie many different ways. I think discipling is the intentional formational process of becoming Christ-like image bearers. And Jesus talks about it, of course, in Matthew 28:18-20, you know, the whole teach them to obey everything I have commanded section. But discipling is more than just teaching. It's teaching for formational purposes. It's helping people to grow and change and become like Christ. And so that's discipling. But then I begin to notice this process that's going on in society, and seemingly to me an increasing measure. And I thought about the term that John uses in his letters, which has become, of course, a rather famous term, the Antichrist. But we've tended to, in modern times, boil that down as though this is a one mysterious figure that will one day be revealed in the future, which is actually not at all how John describes or uses that term. In fact, he says there are many antichrists and they're now here. And he warns against antichrists. And it's these figures who would teach things instead of Christ, or counterfeit Christs in place of Christ. And in a sense, false teachers coming up more from within the church, which is really where the danger often lies. We get so worried about, you know, bad ideas or false ideas or bad philosophies. And even to this day, we get all worked up about what's going on out in the world. But the greatest threat is always from within. And that's kind of the Antichrist concept. And so in that vein, I've sort of applied that to discipling, and I see this process of anti-discipling that's going on in the world and being present in increasingly, and I think alarming degrees within the church. Now, I would want to state that I'm not just talking, excuse me, I'm not just talking about worldly influence, right? That, or, okay, you know, being worldly or secular or something, because of course that's always going to be there and be with us. But I think of a passage, and let me just read this passage, and if I can, in 2 Timothy 3, Paul writes, but mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days, which he was living in. The last days, we continue to be in these last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. And if I stop right there for a second, it's easy for us Christians to go, yeah, that sounds just like our society today. Boy, was Paul spot on. But I think what has kind of escaped our attention in this passage to a degree is verse 5, right? He describes all those things. And then he says, having a form of godliness, but denying its power. Well, the straight up secular world, correct me if I'm wrong here, doesn't have a form of godliness. Where would a form of godliness come into play? Within the church. It's within people who would say, hey, we're following Jesus. This is what we're doing. And so he warns against that. He says, if people are, going to really go down that road and be unrepentant, have nothing to do with such people. Now we've got to apply, I think, scriptural wisdom there and not just say, oh, you fall into that category, you're out. There has to be a process of trying to work with and being very gracious and patient with people and realize that, the line of good and evil never runs between us and them, and it runs down the middle of all of us. So we all have to examine these things. But so this concept is not just worldliness or being influenced by the culture, like I said, it's being formed by something, oftentimes the culture around us, in a way that affects our discipleship. It's a formational process where I think it masks for those who have been fooled by it as part of their Christianity. They think it's feeding into or bolstering their Christianity, and it starts to affect how we read the Bible, how we live the life of Christ, how we view others, how we view the world. And so this anti-discipling comes, again, it's this formational process. And I've often used the example here recently of, I can, and I think you might agree with me on this, I can almost tell more where people are going to come down in positions on issues now based on what news media they trust, rather than whether they're a follower of Jesus or not.
Right.
And it's deeply formational. And it starts to form how we view the world, like I said, how we read the Bible, how we interpret scriptures. And it's deeply affecting. And rather than our biblical Christian worldview changing our vision and dictating how we view political issues or ideological issues or the news at hand or whatever is going on in the world, it becomes the reverse, where we start to let this anti-discipling now view how I'm going to interpret scripture. And it's had a huge impact. And I think we all have to be careful of it. And the thing I've noticed about anti-discipling at Toma is it's always what happens to the other side, right? It's never my side. I'm not formed by the news I watch or social media influences or this bubble. Well, the world has perfected kind of confirmation bias and me hearing what I want to hear and forming us. It forms us into consumers. It forms us one way or the other with political ideology, and it sort of feeds into that. But we fall into this like, no, that's you who's been fooled and taken away from a biblical worldview. I am viewing everything through biblical lens. And I think when we start to think automatically that it's the other guys that are at fault and we're flawless here, that's when we become part of the problem.
Mm-hmm. So I think if I can summarize it in a sense, and hopefully I am accurate in this, it's a way that we're being formed into a way of thinking and living that's different than the way that Christ would want us to live our lives in society today.
Yeah, yes, but I would add the part that we think that it is part of our discipleship. We invite it into our worldview, right? And so that's what I think distinguishes it from just normal worldliness is it does feed and form, and we start to think, well, I don't have to really discern this influence so much because it's a godly influence. But it's what Timothy's talking about. It has a form of godliness. And so I've seen people, that are sincere followers of Jesus become very unforgiving, very without love, brutal. There was a couple years ago where a survey found that people who would claim to be followers of Jesus were the most likely to approve torture.
Yes.
Like, where do you get that from in the Bible?
Yes.
But this is this anti-discipling that comes in, or we start to have enemies, like, well, they are the biggest threat and enemies, and we start to treat people that way, people who are not Christians. Well, that's not how the Bible tells us to view other people. Where does this come from? It comes from this grievance culture, and really, if we look at the news media, it engages in anger porn all the time, and so we start to feed into that. And man, I think the biggest chief, it's not the only one, but the chief sort of influence here would be the news media, and that Christians just imbibe that. And not every Christian, obviously, but far too many of us imbibe that. Social media is another influence. There are other influences, but man, it leads us to just drop our guard and think that this is now a biblical worldview, but it's because our glasses have been changed and we didn't even know it.
Yeah, what I appreciate about what you're saying also is to be very careful when we start thinking it's them. And so I think that gives a big emphasis for us to make sure that we're being humble and we're looking at ourselves and being introspective to make sure that we're not, falling into any of this ourselves. So you kind of covered this a little bit, but what are some of the main areas you feel like the church has been anti-discipled?
Yeah, that's a good one. And let me just say one quick word about your last comment before your question, which is I agree, about the danger of being them. And I've even I had a conversation the other day with a good friend of mine, a young follower of Jesus, and he was trying to talk to a family member of his who is also a disciple and follower of Jesus. But one that he feels like has been pretty taken over by anti-discipling. And he suggested a book for this family member. And the response of this follower of Jesus was, well, is he a liberal? Because if the author's a liberal, I don't want to read it. And, without even no sense of like, let me examine this, test all things, as 1 Thessalonians 5 says, and keep what's good. He'd already drawn the lines of his worldview based on kind of his particular form of anti-discipling. And yeah, that is where it comes in, is news media, politics, the way we identify others. I've talked about that quite a bit lately. We had an episode recently on our podcast where we talked about giving an identity to others other than beloved image bearer. We start to label people, because once we label people, we know how to treat them. So, oh, well, they're liberal, they're conservative, they're Marxist, they're, I'm anti-racist, not anti-racism, but racist. And now I've given you an identity. And so we've got to be really careful about assigning identities other than beloved image bearer. So it is politics. And you see it borne out in Christians being the most likely to embrace news conspiracies. Christians most likely now to identify enemies in the world. And even, I'll give you one concrete example. And I'm talking about the mindset of Jesus following Christians, not nations. That's a separate topic and concept. But in Matthew 25, for example, Jesus talks about, hey, part of what the standard of judgment is going to be how we treat strangers.
Right.
Well, he's not just talking about people walking down the street that you don't know. That word there is xenos. It's foreigners. It's the same word applied to Christians. We are foreigners in the countries that we live in. And so we are to love foreigners, immigrants, people outside. And yet you can have, because of anti-discipling, I think largely, you can have Christians take a very different view that becomes anti-immigrant. And again, I'm not talking about what countries can do or laws they can pass. I'm just talking about in the heart of Christians, we're going to be judged on how we treat foreigners and those in need and the most marginalized. And yet somehow it's become acceptable in 21st century mainstream Christianity in large part to be the least loving towards those people out of anybody in society. Again, not every Christian is like that. I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but it's certainly become a growing problem within the church. And it's not stuff that we're taking from scripture. That's just not. If you throw away all of our political stances and views and all that, and just let scripture dictate, you usually wind up coming to a very different place. And I'm surprised at how often in the church we're having arguments that look a whole lot more like a fight between a donkey and an elephant than sacrificial lambs. And I think that's come from anti-discipling.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that I know Robert P. Jones in his book, A White Too Long, he mentions that, Christians can actually be more racist than the average person, specifically white Christians, that's just from the statistics. And I think that we
or would hold positions that would be viewed in that way. Yeah.
Correct. And I think there's definitely something formationally wrong in terms of how we're superimposing our views and mindsets onto the Bible rather than doing vice versa and making sure the Bible changes us. And as we said a little bit before we started, some of us have been reading our Bibles for decades. And, so my question is, because obviously the answer is get back to the Bible. I mean, that's obviously the answer. But I think if it's been so entrenched that we can't even see the Bible correctly, sadly, you know what I mean? That we've been so indoctrinated, so the anti-discipling has been so strong that even when we read scriptures, we automatically go down a path that doesn't even say, we're reading things right into the Bible even as we read it. So I guess my question with that is, I know you wrote, and I had it here, Escaping the Beast. It's not showing up because of the filter, but the background. But you mentioned some principles in the book there. And I think, like I said, I think it is possible for us to actually be reading the Bible. And because we've been so anti-disciple, to not actually comprehend what we're seeing, if that makes sense. So is there, yes, definitely, let's be praying. Let's have other people involved in our lives. I think definitely God's Holy Spirit can definitely, break through the anti-discipling. But are there some principles that you could maybe share that can help us to, I guess, get back on the right track so we can actually start reading the Bible and see what it actually says, if that makes sense?
Sure. Yeah. And again, let me just stress so that I can't be misunderstood here. I'm not aiming this at one side politically or the other. I think we are all prone to this, right?
Correct.
right, left, up, down, however you want to slice it.
Sure.
This is something that we all need to do. So again, if you're hearing me and going, yeah, that he's right, it's the other side that really needs to examine themselves. That's kind of like the husband that's sitting in a marriage retreat, elbowing his wife, saying, "You need to hear this stuff." That's actually probably the husband then that needs to hear it the most, you know. And so, but I do think there are some principles that can help us. I think the first one I think of is to just check our allegiances. Is Jesus really king, or have we brought in other allegiances? Do we get defensive and feel the need to defend, a political standpoint or whatever, even if it's under the guise of Christianity? Do we feel the need to fight for God? I see a lot of Christians with that mindset. That's not a biblical mindset. Nowhere does God ask us to fight for him. He asks us to become sacrificial, cross-bearing image bearers of Christ. And that's enough. He can take care of himself. He says, let vengeance and things like that belong to me. I'll take care of that side of it. You go, love must be sincere. This is Romans 12, right? And so check if our allegiances are really to the king or to a version of him that we've created and brought in other allegiances with it. I think in the vein of 2 Corinthians 10, 2-5, examine everything, take captive every thought, every position I hold. Let me re-examine it. Is it really biblical? At the end of the day, and you'd be surprised at the things that we can assume, right? And I've seen a lot of little things that you go on the internet sometimes, and people put a sentence up and say, like, what's wrong with this sentence? And you'll read it and you'll be like, I don't see anything wrong. And then there's like a double word or something in it, and your brain just edits it out. You just don't see it until you have to really slow down and read it carefully. So I think we really need to do that with our lives, like slow down and examine everything and probably invite others into that process. And imagine what would happen if we invited others in who thought differently than we do, who see the world from a different perspective than we do in Christ, and brought them in and said, do you see any biases in me? Like, please let me not be defensive, just ask. And they'll probably tend to see it. And maybe we can see theirs, but that doesn't invalidate what they see in me, right? I think the question, am I living as a foreigner? Or have I merged my identity with the nation state in which I live? And now that's become as important to me as the kingdom of God, where I've merged the purposes of those two things together as one. We're called to live as foreigners. Yes, to care about the welfare of the people around us, but in the sense of a foreigner, a citizen of a different place with a different agenda, sometimes than that place in which we live. Am I treating others as image bearers, or am I giving them an identity other than that? It's so easy. As soon as somebody disagrees with me, they're an idiot, they're this, they're that. And once I label them, now I know how to treat them. And Jesus warned against that pretty strongly in the Sermon on the Mount, right? He said, don't label others, don't call them fool, because you will actually be in danger of hellfire if you do that, because you put yourself in a place of judgment and all of that. So watch out for that. Remember that the kingdom must be chosen and can't be forced. Jesus said, don't throw your pearls to pigs. We can't force the kingdom on people. And that's an important caveat to remember. Oftentimes anti-discipling is steering us towards gaining power in a different way. Satan came to Jesus, and if you read the temptations in the wilderness, Satan was fine with Jesus being the Messiah. What he couldn't allow was him to go and do it his own way. He wanted to become the Messiah in Satan's way. The way of the cross wasn't acceptable. Now, I'm not claiming that Satan understood the way of the cross, but he knew that Jesus was up to something and thought, if I can get him to do it my way by grasping power and impressiveness and, all of that, then I'll off-kilter him. We forget that lesson a lot of times as Christians in our culture. to remember that we have a episode coming out, I think next week, where we talk about the idea, Timothy Gambas's idea of the church is God's social justice. That yes, God is about social justice, but not through the means of the world. It is through us creating an alternate society. That's what Paul gets on the church in 1 Corinthians 6 about. He says, you're going to the Roman courts, which are all about inequity. You should be judging these things for yourself. You should be creating an alternate society. And having discernment and wisdom in applying that. Does my kingdom worldview determine my politics, or vice versa? We talked about that, so I'll just leave that one and move on. But I think that's one of those things to examine. Is the version of Christianity that we're living out, is it good news for the most vulnerable and marginalized? Which Jesus said, Luke 4:18, this is good news for the poor and the blind and the oppressed, and so on. Does our mercy triumph over judgment? That's an important one to ask. Or does my judgment sometimes triumph over mercy? Is the church being that alternate way of living? I kind of already hit that one, so I'll move past that one. And the last one I'll mention is are we living self-sacrificially? Or are we more
I'm glad you touched that one. I was like, I know he's going to go there. I hope so.
Oh, yeah. Because, a lot of anti-discipling, again, it will steer us towards our rights, how we're being persecuted, how we're being mistreated, how we're being. I don't ever see in the New Testament a group of people, by the way, who were far more, the early Christians of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, far more persecuted than we are. And yet I don't see them complaining about it. I don't see them whining about it. In fact, if anything, it's like, hey, don't think this is something strange that's happening to you. Don't let this get you down. And when you read in the later 1st and 2nd and 3rd century, when Christians were persecuted, they were like, finally, I've been waiting for this, and at times they have to remind themselves, like, we shouldn't actually want to be persecuted, but they saw it as so part of being a follower of Christ that, they're being led to be burned at the stake, and they're like, don't you dare take this away from me. Don't you try to stop this, because I want to sacrifice for Christ. And so I see us oftentimes much more concerned with our own power, with our preserving our own way of life or culture, rather than, the way of the cross, which is the bloody lamb, is laying our life down. That's what makes changes in the world. That's where the Bible is forming us towards. But we have this anti-discipling coming in with a form of godliness, trying to steer us towards, ourselves.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, very well said. I think, for those that have not read the book, I would highly recommend it. And I think even just from what you're sharing right now, you're very, very careful to make sure that you're not on one side or another, as America typically has, like liberal or conservative, but you're trying your best to just come, I wouldn't even say down the middle, because that's really not the right way. You're really trying to be kingdom focused, kingdom centered, and the chips fall where they are in terms of liberal, conservative, whatever, else may be there. So I definitely appreciate that. So along with the principles that you have shared from Escaping the Beast and so forth, are there any resources that you could recommend that people could either look into? Obviously, as we said earlier, prayer and Bible study, and I think you said reading the Bible even more carefully, and trying to say, hey, what's really being said here, and trying to read it afresh and try to understand what it says for us now, and not think, hey, what does this mean for someone else, is definitely the way to go about it. And also having other people in our lives who maybe have opposing views that can help us see the areas that we could work on, having that humility to ask about some of our blind spots. But are there any resources besides that you can recommend in terms of anti-discipling?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton. I don't know of any book specifically on anti-discipling, because as far as I know, I kind of created that word. I have a tendency to create words. If I can't find one
What
I
was the
like,
other one? Theopolitics was the other one?
you know, I thought it was. I found out since then that other people used that term before I did. And so that's why I always say with anti-discipling, as far as I know, I've never seen it anywhere. But yeah, you know, probably some of my favorite books to get us thinking down that road would be Lee Camp's Mere Discipleship book, Greg Boyd, The Myth of a Christian Nation. I think of Richard Hughes, Myths America Lives By. You know, these are some, there's many more. You can look in the, probably the bibliography of my book, Escaping the Beast, and see some of those others. And our podcast from time to time will highlight some of those books and talk about them or bring in those ideas. Yeah.
The other one that I just finished, and I share this with you, was The Patient Ferment of the Early Church.
Oh yeah, Alan Creeder. Yeah.
I think that's a great book. Just they were not for their rights. They were like, you know what? And they also weren't passing.
That is in the realm of anti-discipling. That's another good one. Yeah.
I mean, they were so like, hey, we're not even inviting people to church until they're. Now that may be an extreme. That's not biblical. That's not like Bible. That's just like kind of how they were. But they were like,
well,
hey,
it was situational. Definitely,
we're gonna get this right ourselves as best they could. I'm sure they were, you know, we're gonna get this right, and then we're gonna try to invite people and other things. But so I think, yeah, there's some great ones out there.
Yeah.
Okay. So I know you recently had some time off for sabbatical, which I think it was, I'm sure, a very relaxing and great time to be with family and so forth. But I'm sure even in that time you had a chance to read a number of books, as I know you love to read, as do I when I'm able. But what were some books that stood out to you during your time?
Yeah, we had a great sabbatical. My wife and I, our youngest son joined us for a portion of it, and our oldest son joined us for a little less of a portion. But we did most of the time in, you know, America's Wonderland, the vacation spot of you know, anyone. Modesto, California, of course. I almost didn't have to say that. No, in fact, when I mentioned to people from California that we were in Modesto, they're like, Modesto? Why? There's nothing in Modesto. I'm like, bingo. There's nothing there. No one that we knew. We were able to really get away. And it was a glorious time to just read and, you know, recharge and do all that. I knew you were going to ask me that question. I was a little stumped. I was like, my goodness. Man, I read so many books and so many good ones. How could I possibly narrow it down? And then I just sort of I thought about it for a minute, and I just said, I'm just going to go with my heart. What books pop into mind? And I think this is a pretty good one, pretty good list. One is Power and Weakness by Timothy Gombis, which I think is just wonderful. I want to make sure, actually, I got that title. It is Power and Weakness. I want to make sure I got the title right. Alan Noble, You Are Not Your Own, I think is a really important book. In fact, now that I think about it, there's an aspect of anti-discipling to that book as well, because he really delves into the topic of how we form our identity, and that we do it the way that culture has taught us to. And that forms much of Christianity, to the point where he says, honestly, if everybody in the country became a Christian overnight, he says, I don't think the major problems we have in society would actually go away, because we've been so formed by the world in certain respects. And we really have to get down to some of the bottom and shed some of how we form identity and stuff. So that's You Are Not Your Own by Alan Noble. And then a book I reread, which I think is so important, especially for anybody that whiffs any sense of leadership in the church, any kind of leadership, is a leader, works with leaders, whatever, is The Way of the Dragon or The Way of the Lamb. I know Kyle Strobel is one of the authors. There's another author, I can't think of it right off. And I loaned my copy of the book to somebody since then, so I didn't get a chance to look on my shelf and see who the other author is. But I think that's a really great book. So those three stand out to me.
Okay, great. That's awesome. I know that I think you had read also King Jesus Gospel was one of the ones that
Sure.
I think you had read, during that time. And I think another one I think you had read, I don't know if it was during your sabbatical, was The Rise of the Modern Self or something like that.
Yeah, Carl Trueman. I thought about mentioning that one, but I think Noble's is in a similar vein. And I think it's a little more accessible than Trueman's book for most people to recommend, like, hey, read one or the other. I think Trueman's book is great. The Rise of the Modern Self, it's helpful, but I would maybe, if you're not a huge reader, then I would say go with Noble's book, You Are Not Your Own.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I guess just in closing, coming into 2022, I know one of the big things happening is you're moving to Texas, I think in the spring, which is huge in and of itself. I don't know.
Well, it is for me. I don't know that it's huge for anybody else, but it is for our family. Yeah.
Well, I just think about it right now. I mean, packing all the books, the bookshelves, and
Oh, dude, I have already, man, I've already got like 15 boxes of books that I'm just going to give away or get rid of or whatever. And somehow I took 15 boxes of books out of here, and I don't feel like I have any less books. Like, I don't know how that happened. I still have like mostly full shelves. So yeah, it's going to be an undertaking.
any big plans for 2022?
Well, so I mean, other than moving, obviously, and we'll see where that goes. And we're really excited to be part of the Dallas Fort Worth church there and work as a teacher there with the church and serve there. I will say this. So in my podcast, All Things to All People, this last season, we've changed the format a little bit slowly, and I brought in two guest hosts. So now it's not my podcast, it's our podcast. Jason Alexander, who is a expert in the Old Testament and a Hebrew scholar, which is good because I'm more versed in the New Testament. And then we have a host who has a journalist background, and she's a news reporter and actually the kind of the head reporter for the NBA G League, Gianna Hearn. She's a great disciple of Jesus. And so they've joined on and kind of rounded out the roster, and the three of us banter and talk about things. And it's much more fun than doing it just by myself. And so we're going to continue to make some changes with that dynamic and format in 2022. In fact, what we've done the last part of this year is really just sort of a preseason and warming up and getting ready for some things that we're going to do. But I can break some news here, if that's okay. I knew I was going to talk to you today, and I talked with Jason and Gianna and said, hey, can I break some news? Because I know Atoma is going to ask me about this. So can I break some news about our podcast?
Yeah, sure,
okay?
Sure.
So I can only tell you part of it, but in 2022, we are going to, I think, make some really exciting overhaul changes. We're changing the name of the podcast. So it's going to have a new name in 2022. I can't tell you what that new name is yet. I know what it is. I can't tell you yet. We're trying to build up some excitement, but we are changing the name and sort of the image of it a little bit, and we're really going to focus, and I'm actually excited about this. And I guess it goes along with what we're talking about here, but we're really going to focus on how we read the Bible and helping people to read it with kingdom glasses on and see it first in context. And so we're going to go through books of the Bible and look at spots, kind of book by book, and go through and show how this works in giving people some maybe background information that they don't know or couldn't easily find out on their own, but then teaching people the basics of how to do that on their own. And it starts with understanding the original situation and context of the Bible so that we can really be fully discipled in the modern context. And I'll give one example. I referenced earlier 1 Corinthians 6, where Paul is chiding the disciples for, taking one another to court. And we can read that in a modern context and just, sit down and have a quiet time in 1 Corinthians 6, the first 11 verses, I think it is, and walk away with, okay, well, what that means for me is I shouldn't take another believer to court. I should try to work it out. Okay, done deal. But when we don't understand the context of what's going on, we miss so much. And the fact that the reason Paul is telling them that is because Roman civil courts were designed to be inequitable. They were designed to advantage high social status people. The high social status, the elites, could sue and take to court the non-elites to get their own rights and advantages and keep the inequitable social order tilted towards the powerful. And so when Paul says some of you are taking others to court, what he means is the rich elite Christians were taking the non-elite Christians to court. And so he says, you're subjecting them to this inequity all over again. You're supposed to be the new creation in the world.
Right.
You're going to rule over the world one day. You should be able to judge and bring true equity to these situations and create a whole new reality. So more than just don't take one another to court, we read that and go, oh, quiet time done. I didn't take atonement to court, so mission accomplished. But there's so much more there. There's don't participate in inequitable situations. There's
Right.
Examine the inequities of society, see if those inequities are seeping into the mindset and structures of the church. Give up your rights, love your brother, sacrifice. There's so many other things there that are going on under the surface, where if we understood the situation, we walk away going, wow, now that's a challenge. Quiet time. That's a lot to work on. That'll take me the next couple of weeks to just sort of, wrestle with that instead of, just don't take one another to court. So we want to go into that. So it is a focus on the ancient texts, but bringing them into the modern world in a very relevant way, and then say, man, how does this apply to our modern situations? And I think in a weird sort of way, Atoma, the more we dig into the history and cultural context of this ancient book, the more it becomes living and active and relevant for the modern world. So we're going to start focusing on that on the podcast. And like I said, I've got our two new co-hosts, and we will unveil the new name of the podcast coming up, but we're really excited about where it's going.
Now you just need, is it Oregon or Origin? Had like 7 scribes that will be able to write down a lot of. See, we need you to put a lot of that into another set of devotionals, so that we can have that, yes, in podcast, but also so you need like some campus students to run around. Not that,
So you want a written form of the podcast, is what you're saying. Okay. Yeah, thanks for giving me more work, Atoma. Thanks for not. I like how you did that. It wasn't like, hey, I could write that down. It's like, you know what you should do? You should do more work.
Well, I do need to get my book going, so we'll be talking.
I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Well, I definitely appreciate your time. I'm sure you got some things you want to dive into the rest of the day here and have an awesome weekend. So I don't want to take more of your time away from that. I do want to just say thank you for your time and for your ministry. It is something I appreciate wholeheartedly, and I know many, many around the world also appreciate it. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Have a good rest of the day.